that's a bit loud. Hello and welcome to the NPR Pod. We've done some upgrades. Look at us. Andrew, do it. We get to do this. How is this affecting the audio? Okay, anyway, so we've got microphones, which is exciting. And we've got the stand and we've got this curtain here, which is quite nice. How are you?
I'm good, Brad. Thanks.
Nice, great.
Oh, nice new tech.
It is new tech. It's all about experimenting, and we'll figure out what works for us. Are you looking at me like this?
Yeah, I'm not quite sure.
Are you clocking the camera?
I don't know. I'm just looking at you.
I like this. If we can get this format going. Okay, you just got back from an amazing talk that you did.
Yeah, I did a talk last week. There was a conference in the Natal Midlands at one of the schools there. It was a fantastic little school, Wickham Collegiate, and they run a sports science conference every year. Funny enough, the conference is called Muscles and Mascara.
Muscles and Mascara?
Muscles and Mascara. I must say, it's an initiative by the school, by their head of their sports science department, a lady called Debbie Bird, fantastic woman that's really driving sports science for the young girls at the school.
The ladies.
And it was fantastic. I mean, I met some wonderful people. Karina Bruver, who's a swimmer, an amazing swimmer, and also a flutist. Andy Burkett, who's a canoeist as well. So
did the flutist talk at the conference?
Did, and also gave a performance.
That's cool.
It was amazing.
What does a flutist? How does it tie into Muscles and Mascara?
Well, it's really just her story. It's so what the conference does is it puts together some sports science, but it also puts together people's struggles. How people achieve things. This particular Karina Brewer, she was one of the first women to swim across False Bay.
Wow!
And then she also swam across from Hermanus to Gansbaai, which
she sounds mental.
In her story is quite remarkable in terms of the challenges that she went through and the things that she faced. So there's some stories there about just people that are just really amazing. There was another guy there, Richard Sutton, who's been the head of the Chinese head of performance at the Chinese Olympic Committee, which again, like his story and what he had to offer was just amazing. So it's just different people giving their stories. My story was just sports science.
Let's get into it. What was your topic? What did you bring to the party for?
Yeah, so I mean, I think one of the big things at the moment is to talk about training load, especially in those high school athletes. And we see it all the time at my practice, and a lot of the coaches are worrying at the moment about schoolboys and girls that are training too much. And the idea would be is how much is enough and how much is too much. And also what we're seeing at the moment, we see a lot of schoolboys, they go to school practices, but they also go to club practices, and they've got coaching on the side, or they're going and doing their own thing, or they've got provincial commitments. So it's not only just what they're doing at school, it's when you add all of those additional things together, how much of that sort of puts them past the point of improving their performance, and then puts them at risk of either getting injured or being unhealthy.
Before I let you go forth and talk us through your talk, because that's what I want to hear, because you've had a presentation. Is it relating to kids being given too much by coaches and teachers and stuff at school, or is it the addition of them getting into the gym culture and stuff on the side? Or is it all together?
I think, in fact, one of the questions that I was asked based on this podcast in terms of what we've released in the past, it was from a parent and saying, well, how do we actually manage it? And I think maybe to answer your point, it's actually just about understanding all the factors that deal with that as a child. And children are unique. They're not little adults. They have unique challenges. They have unique stresses that you don't have as adults, and maturity or maturing is one of them. So I think to answer your question, it's not so much about the gym culture. It's more about being able to manage each athlete as an individual, as a whole, so that when you look at the school coach, if the school coach doesn't know that you're having private coaching or that you're doing additional work on the side of that, you can't then go back and blame the school or the school coach for what they don't know. And I think it's actually turning around to that parents need to be aware of it, and the athletes themselves. The girls and boys that are doing these sports need to be aware of how much is enough, how much is too much, and what are those things that affect me. One of the things that we've seen a lot of is that injury rates tend to go up, injury and illness rates tend to go up in and around exams. So obviously, in a working environment as mature adults with professional sportsmen, you don't really get that to a large extent, but certainly in young kids. when they grow and develop and they're at school and, there's some pressure academically, we see the injury rates go up. So
is that mental stress? Or?
Well, yeah, it's just a stressor, and that's the thing. Training is a stressor. Exams, the stress that you get from having to be at school at a certain time, to study, to keep up to date, or if you didn't do well in an exam, there's pressure all the time. So I think it's actually about managing the person, as a whole person, not just as an athlete or as a sports person.
Interesting. Okay, your talk on training load.
Yeah, well, I think a lot of it it starts around what are those stressors that we have to look at in this particular age group, and probably one of the biggest things is about maturation and growing, and when people grow, there's something called your peak height velocity that you reach.
Your peak height. I need to put this on a graph when I edit this. Your peak height velocity.
So in other words, it's the point at which you are growing the quickest.
Okay.
And through adolescence. So adolescence is probably a time span in your life from about 10 years of age through to about 18. And you go through two major growth spurts in that time.
From 10 to 18?
Yeah, the first one initially is generally in your legs. So again, that's why we see a lot of injuries, a lot of issues around legs, knees, ankles in primary school kids. And that's generally when it happens.
10 to 13.
10 to 13, yeah. And then what happens is then the later growth spurt, the second part of the growth spurt then happens in adolescence, so the later part in adolescence. And that's where you get a significant difference between boys and girls. Okay. So girls will generally grow earlier. They develop, they become women a lot sooner than men become men. Boys become men, should I put it that way. So firstly, you've got a gender difference. So girls will tend to mature earlier, they grow earlier. So their peak height velocity happens slightly earlier than boys. And again, the stats that we've got, a lot of them are based on European or American norms. And they're sort of saying that peak height velocity in girls is happening between 14 and 15 and guys 16 or 17. But there's such a wide variety in that. There's such a span of that it's very difficult to identify that you only got to look at it when guys are hitting 15 or 16 years of age. So what you find is that you grow in that period and you grow taller by about 9 to 10 centimeters. That's a lot. So you can imagine if I added 6 centimeters to you and then I said to you, right, go and play a football game, your feet would be all over the show. And the thing is, in this second growth spurt, the majority of the growth happens from your back through your thoracic spine into your shoulders. So
when's the second one?
Well, that's the second one, probably 15, 16 years of age. That's the high school one. So again, the injuries that we see in high school athletes are generally around lower backs, shoulders, because that's where the majority of the growth happens. So you grow, and then the funny thing about that is that about 9 months later, you then put on weight. And again, you put on 9 to 10 kilos. But so when you grow taller, and you can see it, a lot of the parents out there will know this. It's almost intuitive. You see your child grow up, and they become these long little string beans, especially if they're young boys. They become these long, tall, thin string beans. And then what happens is about 8 or 9 months later, they suddenly then fill out. And that's sort of the time period which they are hugely at risk in terms of injury, in terms of illness, in terms of understanding as a coach what their training load should be like and what they should be doing in that time period.
Do coaches know this?
I don't know.
I don't think that my training ever changed when I hit a growth spurt.
Yeah.
Saying, should this be
I think though that it becomes, what the coaches do need to understand then is that when they put on weight, and then there's a huge gender difference. So when they put on weight that 8 or 9 months later after their growth spurt.
And when you say weight, you're saying muscle or
weight,
you're saying
okay,
fat.
so that's the difference. You see, that's the key thing. Boys put on lean muscle mass. Girls put on fat mass. So for a young girl, well, I think it's a more holistic than just that, Brad. But I think for a young girl, they put on 8 or 9 kilos, and it's not functional weight. So it's not weight that can help you move or protect your body.
Right.
It's fat mass. Whereas for a boy, it's generally muscle mass. And I think that's where we see a huge discrepancy. Now, that is something that coaches should know. The other thing that we also pick up is as women. As girls become women and they get their menstrual cycle, you start to see that at various stages in their cycle, they are more inclined to get injured because of their hormone changes.
Really?
And in the follicular phase, which is the first sort of 14 days, they're hugely at risk of getting injured. from a ligament and a muscle strength point of view. And there's some really interesting research coming out, and they're doing a lot of it in soccer at the moment. And they realize that ACL injuries are massively high in women in the first 14 days of their cycle.
Do you know what hormones affect?
Well, it's
your
estrogen.
tendon?
Yeah, it's estrogen. So estrogen is the big thing there.
That's
So what, again, one of the simple things as a coach, if you're coaching young girls, it's a very difficult question as a guy to have to ask, but if you want to be a good coach or a good trainer, you have to know where they are in their cycle, because that will affect, number one, it affects the injury rates massively, and also number two, it affects their ability to manage whatever it is, whatever the type of training that they're trying to achieve.
ETA is an agile, forward-thinking, private higher education provider that prepares students for the ever-evolving world of work. Globally recognized in its specialist fields, ETA delivers academic excellence, innovation, and community impact to help students thrive in a complex professional landscape. With study options in sport, fitness, coaching, and management, ETA covers all corners of the sporting industry, preparing graduates for real-world success. ETA's purpose is to deliver future-fit education that empowers students with knowledge, skills, and a clear philosophy to guide their learning, careers, and lives.
That's very interesting.
So I mean that's sort of where it starts. Maturation and growth and height and that it's vitally important. And there was a graph which I put up, which is very complicated.
We're going to put it up here.
But it generally looks at when you are reaching that peak height velocity and how your risk of injury changes, and then
talk to the graph. What's the graph telling us?
I can't because I don't remember the graph.
Okay, that's fair.
So sorry, I can't.
No, that's fair. That's fair. But what's the graph sort of telling us?
No, so the graph is just sort of highlighting that there are.
Is it showing the different stages?
Yeah, so it shows the difference between girls and boys in terms of when they mature, when they reach peak height velocity, as well as then what it looks like on either side of that graph. So too little training and you're not doing enough, too much training and these are the injuries and these are the issues that you may or may not be facing.
So what message, so you as a speaker, what message were you trying to convey to the coaches? I'm assuming, was it to parents?
Yeah, it was the crowd was, I mean, it was much the same as I think our audience. It was a combination of athletes themselves, so the young girls at the school. It was also to quite a few parents, and then also just clinicians, physios, trainers, bios, personal trainers, that sort of thing, and coaches. Just for them, the aim of what I'm trying to do is just to try and get some sort of understanding there, is that when you're a coach, you don't have to have like all these tracking devices. You don't have to have these like catapult suits that people put on to track how much, how far, how fast. But if we're just tracking height and weight, it's a really simple measure, but yet we don't track it, because you can pick up when people are starting to grow. And if you did that once a month, and again, if it comes back into, if you offer a physical education class and once a month in phys ed, you're doing height and weights, you'll get a very good indication of when people are starting in that process of growing. And that, once you know that, then you can then adjust, and you can say as an individual, this is the period that you're going through, this is your phase of your development and your maturation, and we can adjust accordingly. So it's about getting some knowledge and some information out there, and it's also about trying to also come up with some really simple things that have some scientific validity that people are using, and techniques that you can use, which are really quite simple. You don't need technology. You don't need a lot of information. You don't need a lot of stuff. You do just need to do something consistently.
Are you referring to taking a height and weight test, or are you talking about simple things that you can do to their training to stop them from being injured?
No, so it's actually just looking at what are there actual mechanisms or ratios or measurements that you can take that's going to give you some indication of when somebody's body, when a young person's body is then going to go through a massive change.
This is what NPR does, which is cool. So let's get into it. What measurements, so you said height and weight, what else would you say is something that you can track and identify if someone is going through their phase of growth?
So the way that you sort of give this out, and again, a lot of parents might know this, the very first thing is that you never allow the number of training hours to exceed the age of the person. So training hours in a week versus the age.
That's a very easy way to...
That is. It's very easy. And in actual fact, the best ratio is if you're at about 80% of that. So in other words, if you are 13, you look down at 80% of what 13 is, and that's the maximum amount of training hours, and I say training and competition hours, that young person should be dealing
What's
with
that,
in a
like
week.
10 a week-ish?
Yeah, about
Yeah.
10, yeah, 9, 10 in a week.
And is that spread over practices with the team?
Practices, any practice.
Gymming.
See, again, so as a parent, when it comes back to one of your first questions, as a parent, you can then manage it. As an athlete, you can manage it, because as parents know that I'm taking you to this class, then I'm going to extra lessons here, then we're going there, and then you've had 2.5 hours at school. So you then get to add that all up. And very often the school coaches are oblivious to this, because they just, they're practicing, they're doing their hockey or their rugby or their cricket or their swimming. So they're just doing that, but they don't realize that after that, the person then goes to extra this, extra that, club this, club that. So again, as a parent or as an athlete, it's easy enough just to look at that and to calculate that.
Okay, we're changing the style of this chat, and it's now turning into the 3 things that'll stop your growing child from being injured. So number 1, the rule that you just said: don't let your child train more than their age.
That's the first rule.
Okay.
So that's a very simple one, and probably the easiest one to manage.
That's
The second one is measure height and weight. I mean, I grew up, I think we still have it, my kids still have it, we still have an area in our house where...
With the lines.
With the lines, and you can check it. So, once a month, once every 2 months, height and weight measurements, even if it's a simple height, if you're in a boarding house or whatever, just measure your height. And understand that if you suddenly go through a growth spurt and your height velocity is changing quite rapidly, then you are going to go through a weight gain 8 to 9 months later. And again, I think those are vitally important conversations for people to have, for coaches to have with girls and boys, that, don't worry about supplementing in that meantime. Your body will naturally start putting on weight over that. And I think especially for some of the young girls that are involved in sports where weight becomes an issue or weight is a factor, I think it's important to tell them that, because this is part of maturing. And I think if they understand it, they might not like it, but at least they'll have an understanding of why my body's changing like it is. And so there's education that can take place at the same time.
How long does the growth spurt normally, is it quite set?
It's varied.
Between girls
It's varied. I mean, it's varied. Some people develop earlier, so you've got early maturers. Other people develop late. You've got late maturers, So it's and the time period which you grow is also individually determined.
Okay, so we got the age.
You've got age.
Then we got the height and weight. On the height and weight, you have little Sarah, and she's 11 years old, and you see a growth spurt there. What are you doing as a parent / coach / expert to stop her from being injured, or to prevent it?
Well, I think there's a conversation that needs to take place, is that if you pick up that that's happening, that that's a very vulnerable stage for them to pick up injury and or get ill, also get sick. And so what you then do is you then have a conversation with a coach to say, okay, if there's additional coaching that's going on, in other words, if you are almost at that limit or at that peak of a number of training hours in a week versus your age, then you might want to drop that down just for that period, to ensure that you then, you can then monitor the load that person is able to achieve. I would also suggest that you then, you look at alternative ways. And if you've got a coach or a trainer that understands what they're doing, they will then change the types of training sessions that they were doing. So it's just about managing. It's just about educating. And once you identify, you then just drop it down accordingly.
And same for Sarah and Johnny. So similar.
Well, yeah, no, it should not be same. Everybody must be dealt with as an individual. And as I said, Sarah as a woman, Johnny as a male, it's going to happen at different times, and the intervention should be slightly different, because when Johnny grows, Johnny's going to put on muscle mass. Ultimately, yes. Sarah's not as much, and she puts on a lot more fat mass. So the interventions might need to be different. Your talking, what you say, your education needs to be very different. And ultimately, then your intervention does need to be tailored specifically to that person in that particular environment.
Okay. So height and weight. Are there any other measurements there that you would do, or is that's what you want to focus on?
Those are just very simple ones. The more you have available to you, the more you could look at. But at the moment, height and weight, that's a simple
good place
one.
to start. Okay.
The third one is something called the acute to chronic workload ratio. Okay, and it sounds really complicated, but basically what it does,
it sounds cool.
It looks at your workload over a lengthy period of time, and it's generally a 3 to 4 week period. And once you've worked out your workload,
When you say workload, you're talking about training.
Okay,
Training
so
day.
I'll get to that. So what you do is you look at it over a 3 to 4 week period, and you get an average. So what does it look like week by week, and you average that out, and then you look at what am I doing this past week, and what you do is you get a ratio, and generally if your ratio is 0.8 to 0.9, you're in what they call a sweet spot. So in other words, your training this week hasn't been so hard that it's way above what you've done before. Similarly, it hasn't been so low that you're almost under training. Do you understand? If your acute to chronic workload is 1.5, in other words, it means that your training this past week has been so hard.
Is that so? You're saying it's 1.5 times what you normally train?
Yeah, well, in a way, yeah,
Okay.
because you put it as a ratio. So it's been so hard compared to what you're used to. You probably are fatigued. And so
Okay.
your risk of injury, your risk of having a bad performance is much higher. Similarly, if your ratio is 0.6, you've done very little this week.
So you can push.
And again, that depends on what the aim of the week is. It depends if you're coming out of injury or if you're coming back from illness or if it's been pouring with rain for the last 5 days. You know, there are ways and means that you've got to look at that. But this ratio becomes vitally important. And again, the key here, Brad, is just to look at how do I get that workload? And it's very simple. You just times everything that you do. So in other words, if I'm going to train in the afternoon and I've got an hour and a half practice session, an hour and a half is 90 minutes. I times 90 minutes by what we call my RPE, which is my rate of perceived exertion. Because you and I would go to the same practice, and you might, as a player that's either accommodated or is better or fitter than me, or that just plays in a different position, your perceived exertion of that practice might be a 1 or a 2, very light. So you're timesing 90 minutes by 1 or 2. I might have gone there and said, geez, the coach has put me under pressure. I'm a 7. So do you understand?
What determines your RPE?
So it's a subjective rating. You determine it.
Yourself or the coach to your players?
No, so there's a rating. There's the RP, the Borg scale. So again, we can put that up. Yeah, we can put that up.
We're going to smash so much information
and
up here.
it's a rating of 1 to 10, and that's very, very subjective. The best thing about it is that your scale is going to consistently be your scale. So your 1 is always consistently going to be your 1. But your 1 and my 1 will be different. Because we're different, we're individuals. So when you self-report and self-reflect on how hard that was, you would be very consistent in the numbers that you give yourself.
Yes.
But your numbers and my numbers will be quite different. And that's where you have to come about. That's where we look at the coach and say, deal with it individually. Because how many times do you go to practice session and your session, you come out and you think, sheesh, that was easy. I'm coming out of it and I'm like, because I'm a forward, or we did these type of drills, which was meant for me, not for you. So my perception is much higher than your perception, which means that the workload, the load, the stress that I put my body under in that practice session was much higher than yours.
Does that... Excuse me. Does that mean that a coach should be going fast bowlers train together, opening batsmen train together, props train together, wings train together?
Not at all.
Because how do you train an RPE of 7 and a 1 together?
No, but you remember, we're individuals. So although you work in a team, even within a team environment, people are going to deal with things differently. Because take this as an example. So let's say, for instance, I've just come out of writing an exam at school, and I don't think I did very well. Do you think that would influence the way I go into a training session if I'm got a hockey practice or a rugby practice? I think it would.
Yeah.
So my perception, because maybe I didn't sleep well the night before, I only had 3 or 4 hours of sleep, I was cramming,
stressed.
I might not have eaten as much. So when I get to practice, I'm tired already. So now what you, who didn't do that particular subject, haven't written that exam, had a good night's sleep, your perception of what that practice is totally different to mine. So it's the same practice. So I'm not suggesting that the coaches need to change things. I'm just saying that we need to start looking at that the same practice session can mean totally different things for 2 individuals in the same team.
How often, you said it's subjective, how often does an RPE change? I'm saying, is that just a coach, like how often do you get a new or be assessed?
So in this instance, what you do is you just make it consistent. You say, right, you've got to take an RPE within 30 minutes out of finishing a training session. So again, for a coach who's generally got a clipboard there or has generally got his practice plan there, he says, right, okay, Brad, from today's session, what do you think? And you'd say 5, sir. Somebody else will go 2, somebody else will say 9, somebody else will say 8. What you do is you just load that down. Then you put it into your spreadsheet. The next day when you go to practice, we do the same thing within half an hour. So you just become consistent in it.
So then you get those results, then what do you do? So how do you use those?
So you
for
add
your
them all
next-
up. So all you do is you add that all up, and you divide it by 7. So you get your weekly number.
Okay.
And that's the workload. So that's your weekly number, and it's not it doesn't mean anything.
Yeah.
It's just a weekly number that is added at that. That's got all your data on it. The next week you go to the same thing, and maybe you slept better. So your weekly number might drop down. Your daily average will drop down, but your weekly average will drop down. And that's the chronic part of it. So what you're trying to do with that, the chronic part of that workload is trying to drop everything down. Or to try and just measure it. What is it like over week 1, week 2, week 3, week 4? And then when you get to week 5, what you want to see what last week was like, you then do that. When you get to another week later on, last week becomes part of your chronic, and then the week before becomes your acute.
So that's saying, how did I train last week? I was chilled out. So that means I can push harder this week.
Yeah, potentially. Yeah. And that's where the coaches come in. And that's and we see this very, very closely. And I mean, this has been done in sort of professional sport for
Is it
years.
being done?
Yeah, it is being done. I know the cricketers use it a lot, rugby players use it a lot, and they've got a lot of other techniques. They use the Shims test, or they have used the Shims test.
What's
in
a
the
Shims
past.
test?
So the Shims test is just it's almost like part of a bleep test, which you can take certain levels of the bleep. Generally, they take sort of 8, 9, and 10, and you just run it consistently, and you measure your heart rate. And it's just recovery. So it's another way of identifying your recovery. So it also helps you monitor the training load. So is my load too much? Am I training too hard? And I mean, there's a wonderful anecdotal story. I don't know how true it is, but around, it was probably before you were born, like 95 World Cup.
I was 5.
And South Africa played a semi-final at Kings Park in Durban. And it was a huge game.
France.
It was against France, and it was going to be in the pouring rain.
That controversial match.
Yeah, it turned out to be quite controversial. From what I understand, the coach, who I think was Kitch Christie at the time, he sort of told the props, he said, just go and have a break, like before their like one of their last practice sessions. And he in his head, he felt that he wanted those props to be at their freshest. And, it comes down to a scrum on your 5-yard line on 80 minutes. And these 3 guys these 2 guys sort of held it up. So, I mean, there's that sort of anecdotal evidence to sort of, it becomes a bit like folk history and folklore, but I think it works. And I think what we see in those teams and in those sports that are doing this, that are managing and that are monitoring it, the risk of injury is less. And ultimately the performances go up. Because what we do understand is you can't just sort of be training at a level and then suddenly because the coach has had a fight with their wife or with their girlfriend, suddenly like everybody's doing hundreds or you're doing 150s, that sort of thing. So a way it's just a way for us to be able to manage things.
So at an elite level, I would assume that they're all being managed and going like, this person can go hard today, this person maybe chill out because he's got a niggle, this person's sick, and someone's managing that. At a schoolboy level or schoolgirl level, how is that managed? I'm assuming it's not being managed, and that's the problem.
Well, I think that was part of why I wanted to talk about it, because I think there's some very simple things that you could test and manage and identify that would have some quite big ramifications. You see, the problem in our country is we don't keep a track record of injuries. A lot of the schools here in Cape Town, they've all got physios that are on campus. But no one releases the injury rates. No one tells us what are the injury rates, like when are the people getting injured, because we don't know. We've got a lot of information that we get from overseas. The big universities like UCT, Stellenbosch, Tuckies, they're doing a lot of insightful research into it to try and give us more information so we can intervene, we can plan interventions better. So with the lack of understanding in that regard, what we're trying to do is say, well, if we can avoid the injuries, let's try and do that. Let's also try and improve the performances. Because you've got all of this, and then you've also got that attrition rate that we've spoken about why do people stop playing sport? I just don't think it's because it's managed, because they have a bad experience. They might play, they might get a bad or catastrophic injury as a youngster. And I think if we can reduce a couple of those, 100 of those, 1,000 of those every year, then I think, we're just going to have a healthier population, and we're going to have a better sport population. We're going to have more people that are going to just enjoy sport more.
So number 1. We've got number 1, the age. Number 2, the height and weight. Number 3, say that one more time.
It's the acute to chronic workload.
Okay, and in one sentence, if possible, what you would tell a coach or a parent to do with their kids in terms of that? Measure
the acute to chronic workload.
Yes.
So all you got to do is just work out what your perception of the effort is and the number of minutes that you practiced. That's the very basic, very, very basic that you can do.
So it's the score times the times the minutes
times your effort.
gives
So
you
your effort versus the minutes, and it just gives you a number.
And what do you do with that number?
You just you calculate that number. You do it on a day-to-day basis, and eventually you average it out for the week, and then you do it the following week, and then you see how that number fluctuates.
Okay.
You understand?
And
what I
you're
mean?
trying to keep it level. And
So
steady.
again, and more importantly, when these things become major issues, is that number one, you'll see a massive increase. So from a pre-season, you'll go from being a hockey player in winter to a polo player in summer. And you see all of a sudden, because I'm transitioning to sports, all of a sudden my numbers are going up because I've got hockey practices, which haven't reduced, but I've now suddenly got polo practices. And if your ratio is 1.5, you know that there's a period here at which you are going to be going through issues.
Because your minutes are also increasing.
See, so that's the thing. So it's a number thing, but you've also got to then look a little bit more holistically. And the numbers, the reason why your perception of the effort might be high is those external factors. So those factors about school, about socializing, maybe there's a breakup with a girlfriend or a boyfriend, maybe there's an exam, maybe you haven't done well, maybe there's some peer pressure going on, maybe mom and dad are under some sort of financial stress and you're starting to feel it. I mean, the things that young children go through that aren't applicable for an adult, that we also just come into that. So in a sense, you can have that as a first question, as a first point of call, but you've then got to be able to look a little bit more broader than that. And then start to unpack it as an individual. So it's not as a team thing, but that's when the coaching, that's when the soft skills of coaches need to come in and say, hey, Brad, I see you struggled here. What's going on? Nah, I had a bad exam. Okay, that's cool. I understand that. Okay, so just sit out here or go lightly today or do that. And I think that holds a lot of ground.
I like the fact that you could bring it back to a number on a paper that can give you the answer. And that's what's fascinating about the testing is the results are the results. So I think that's a great way. So those are the three. What would be your quick 4 and 5 before we wrap up, or for just an extra bonus tidbit that parents or coaches can look at, or the kids?
Yeah, look, to me, keep it simple to start.
Okay.
You know, don't try and do what the professionals do. They're professionals for a reason, and they have a lot more money and they have a lot more technology. But if we can do that for a start, I think you'd be amazed at what consistency can do. Same as in training. If you're consistent in terms of just managing and identifying what your training load is, great. I think you that's 4 and 5. Just being consistent.
4 and 5. Okay. Just quickly. So that's, say I'm a cricket player and I'm doing that for my cricket training at school. When I go to the gym, I'm doing the same thing. Is that included in the minutes, or am I focusing it on?
And you've got to be careful with certain sports like cricket, or maybe even like with something like water polo. You can have a differential there. So cricketers, there's a lot of studying, a lot of information around cricket, fast bowlers, adolescent bowlers, because of the risk of back pain and injuries to the lower back, stress fractures. There are actually some very, very clear-cut guidelines in terms of how many balls bowled in a week and how those balls should be broken up amongst the days. So there's very, very specific guidelines that have been given out through Cricket South Africa.
For the growth spurts?
Just general. Okay. So now 13, 14, 15. And they're very, very specific, even to a point where a lot of the games were, the way that school cricket is set up, it's set up that you can't bowl more than 5 overs at a time. So the schools have adopted that quite well. What you would need to do, though, is I'd challenge any cricket fast bowler, because in my experience, they don't count the number of balls they bowl in a practice. They'll say to you, right, I bowl for half an hour, I bowl for 2 hours. Well, how many balls is that? They've got no idea. So in that instance, then add the number of balls that they bowl. So I practiced for an hour and a half. My rate of exertion was 6, so you times your 90 by 6. And then as a side piece to that, I bowled so many balls. Because if you bowl so many balls on a Monday, so many balls on a Tuesday, so many balls on a Wednesday, you'd find out eventually that you're probably bowling a lot more than you think you are. And where we've also noticed that in cricket is that you then bowl at school practices, but then I'd go to a private coach in the afternoon. But I wouldn't be counting that because I only go practice for half an hour. But I'd bowl 50 or 60 balls there on a hard surface, indoors. And so all of a sudden, everything changes. In polo players, we get the same thing. I mean, again, you look at the stats, you look at data. In polo, in a game, how many times does a polo forward shoot the ball? Or a wing? How many times do they shoot the ball? 5? Maybe 7? How many times do they practice shooting at school? Guys, either as a warm-up or as a cool-down. Okay, let's shoot. We're going to shoot for 20 minutes. So they're probably going to shoot 20 or 30 times. at a practice. Now, in the States, it's totally the other way around.
They'd shoot 7 times.
They shoot 4 times.
Hard.
But you only shoot 4 times. When you're this age, when you're that age, you shoot 5 times. So they've got a structure. They've got a progressive structure of how it works. And all you're doing, and the reason why they've done that is because they've looked at the data, they've looked at the science, and they say, when do people get injured? When do adolescents get injured in water polo? It's not when you're passing the ball to your mate.
It's when you shoot.
You get injured when you shoot because your shoulder's under huge pressure. So what they do is they reduce the risk. So you reduce the risk of at practice, and ultimately, if you're only going to shoot the ball 5 times in a game, well, then that's what you need to practice.
Very cool. So if someone watching this wants to send in to us how much they train, how they feel, send that information, can we break it down?
Yeah, we can try to do it. I mean, but we need people to be honest. We need people to say, right, I go to this, I do that, because I sometimes feel that, in my practice, when people get injured, they don't want to tell you everything that they're doing, or the parents don't want you to tell you everything that they're doing, because I think in a way you sort of know that it's too much. And I'm not saying that we shouldn't push our children. I'm not saying that they shouldn't train hard, because I think that's another conversation. I think we should actually be training them harder, but not longer.
Yeah.
And this thing about load is that young children growing up do not have a capacity for a lot of endurance sport. They need to be trained by going at a slightly higher intensity, but for shorter periods of time, because their bodies are just adapted to that.
I think we need to get you with a whiteboard, yeah. When Andrew gets a whiteboard, that's when Andrew gets fired up.
Yeah, but no one will be able to understand my writing.
No, it's not that bad. I have learned over 8 years. But I think, even if it's a chat GPT, we're going to do a case study with the whiteboard, and you're going to explain this deeper.
Fine. Happy to do that.
Happy. All right, Andrew, thank you very much.
Thanks, Brad.
We chat. That was 35 minutes.
Easy.
Amazing. When is your next chat? Are we going to get footage of your chat so we can also...
I don't know. I hope so, Brad. I've got to speak to Debbie Bird.
Debbie Bird, please.
Debbie Bird.
Debbie. Please, Debbie. Debbie, please. I think she'll do it now.
Hope so.
Okay. Cool. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Brad.
If you loved what you watched today, please click like and subscribe and send your case studies in. Andrew's like a real-life living ChatGPT with flaws and everything, which is way more accessible. So... follow, like, subscribe. We will see you next time. What are we going to chat about next? I'm putting you on the spot because we haven't actually discussed this.
We are about the intensity of training.
Intensity of training.
Yeah. So what sort of intensity should we be training at? And are we training the right things at the right times? Because again, just as a sort of an introduction...
I'm trying to close the show, Andrew.
Sorry, but
okay,
you see, you've got me going now. As an intro, what we need to be able to do is we need to say, well, we do need our athletes to train harder. Because we've already discussed that those young kids coming into high school are weaker and not as fit as they used to be 10 or 15 years ago. Certainly my age, we were way fitter than these youngsters and stronger. So what needs to happen is that the training becomes more important, but it's the right type of training. And funnily enough, if we go back and we look at development, we look at maturation, and we look at how we grow, we have certain window periods and certain times when our body is better adapted to certain things than others. And that's what we're going to chat about.
Okay, well, there you go. You heard it here first at the NPR Performance Pod. All right, thank you, Andrew. That was awesome.